Did you know that some of the greatest literature ever written in the ancient world was not written in Greece, not in Rome, not in Mesopotamia, but in Egypt more than 4,000 years ago, by black African scribes sitting along the Nile? And the dynasty that produced that literature, that rebuilt Egypt after collapse, that expanded its borders, reformed its government, and gave Africa one of its most organized and prosperous eras of rule, was Dynasty 12, the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom. This is not a story about pyramids built on broken backs. This is a story about a civilization that understood itself, that wrote poetry about loss, that trained administrators, not just soldiers, that made art because art mattered. Egypt at a different kind of greatness. Before we get into the glory, we have to understand what came before it. Egypt had collapsed, not once, but severely. The Old Kingdom, that age of the Great Pyramids at Giza, had ended in chaos. A combination of drought, famine, and the breakdown of central power had fractured Egypt into competing regional lords. Historians call this the First Intermediate Period. It lasted roughly from 2160 BC to 2055 BC. The country was divided. Thebes in the south and Heracleopolis in the north fought for control of the Nile Valley. It was Mentuhotep, the second of Dynasty 11 out of Thebes, who reunified Egypt around 2055 BC. We covered his story in episode 2 of our volume 2 of Egypt and Nubia, the complete history. He was the one who picked up the pieces. But the dynasty that truly built on that reunification, that turned recovery into a golden age, was Dynasty 12. And it began with a man named Amenemhat I. Amenemhat I came to power around 1985 BC. He was not from a royal bloodline in the traditional sense. He had served as Vizier, the highest government official under the last king of Dynasty 11. He likely took the throne through a coup. Egyptologist Nicholas Grimmel, in his authoritative work A History of Ancient Egypt, describes the transition to Dynasty 12 as one marked by political maneuvering rather than simple inheritance. One of Amenemhat's first decisions tells you everything about his mind. He moved the capital out of Thebes, the traditional southern stronghold, and into a new city he founded himself, Ichtawi, located near the Fayum region in the north. The name meant Sizer of the Two Lands. That was not modesty, that was a statement. He was claiming control of all Egypt, north and south, and placing himself at its center. Egyptologist Miriam Lichtheim, whose 3-volume work Ancient Egyptian Literature remains one of the most important collections in the field, notes that it was during this Dynasty 12 period that royal propaganda and literature were used deliberately to reinforce central authority. Amenemhat understood something that modern leaders still struggle with. The pen and the sword must work together. And this is where it gets extraordinary. During the reign of Amenemhat I, a text was composed that scholars call the Instruction of Amenemhat. It is written as a message from the king to his son, Senusret I. But the timing of this text is striking. It was written after Amenemhat's assassination. He was killed in his own palace, in his own bed, by his own court. The text, which Miriam Lichtheim translates in full in Ancient Egyptian Literature Volume 1, presents the king speaking from beyond death, warning his son. He says, "Do not trust a brother. Do not trust a friend. Do not make companions, for there is no profit in it." He describes how he fought to build Egypt, how he gave to the poor, how he planted trees and raised cattle, only to be betrayed by the very men he had trusted. This is not just history. This is a father's grief written in stone, and it was composed over 4,000 years ago on African soil by African hands. His son, Senusret I, survived the coup and took the throne around 1956 BC. He became one of the most formidable rulers Dynasty 12 would ever produce. Where his father had focused on consolidating internal power, Senusret I looked outward. He launched military campaigns into Nubia to the south, pushing Egypt's border deeper into what is today northern Sudan. He built a chain of forts along the Nile south of Aswan to control trade and movement through the region. Archaeologist Stuart Tyson Smith, in his work Wretched Kush, Ethnic Identities and Boundaries in Egypt's Nubian Empire, documents how these forts were not merely military installations. They were economic checkpoints and administrative centers. Egypt was not just conquering, it was organizing. Senusret I also commissioned one of the most ambitious building programs Egypt had seen since the Old Kingdom. He rebuilt and expanded the temple at Karnak in Thebes. A single white chapel he built at Karnak, known today as the White Chapel of Senusret I, still partially survives. It is covered in finely carved reliefs. Egyptologist Dieter Arnold, in the Encyclopedia of Ancient Egyptian Architecture, describes it as one of the finest examples of Middle Kingdom craftsmanship ever found. He also built a pyramid at Lisht. It was not the scale of Khufu at Giza, but it was built with intention, surrounded by subsidiary pyramids for his queens and officials, and decorated with refined reliefs. The Old Kingdom had built for size. The Middle Kingdom built for meaning. Now let us talk about something that does not get enough attention in mainstream Egyptian history. The Middle Kingdom was the golden age of Egyptian literature. Not just religious texts, not just king lists, actual literature, stories, philosophy, poetry, wisdom, writings. Egypt was producing written culture that the ancient Greeks, centuries later, would read and admire. One of the most famous texts of this period is the story of Senusret. Written during the early Dynasty 12 period, it follows an Egyptian courtier named Senusret, who, upon hearing of Amenemhat I's death, flees Egypt in fear and lives among foreign peoples in what is today the Levant. He rises to prominence there, fights battles, starts a family, grows old, but he longs for home, he longs for Egypt. And the king eventually calls him back, and he weeps when he crosses the border again. Egyptologist John Baines, in his chapter Contributions to Ancient Egypt, A Social History, edited by Trigger, Kemp, O'Connor, and Lloyd, describes Senusret's tale as evidence of a sophisticated literary culture in which individual emotional experience was treated as a subject worthy of extended artistic treatment. This was not common in the ancient world. Egypt was doing something that other civilizations would not do for centuries. Another key text of this era is The Eloquent Peasant, a story in which a peasant whose goods are stolen pleads his case before an official with such powerful eloquence that the king secretly orders the case delayed just so he can keep hearing the man speak. The text is, at its heart, an argument that justice must be upheld, that the poor man's voice matters, written in Egypt over 3,900 years ago. Miriam Lichheim, in Ancient Egyptian Literature, Volume 1, translates both Senusret and The Eloquent Peasant in full, and notes that the language of Dynasty 12 became the classical standard of the Egyptian language for centuries after. The way Chaucer and Shakespeare are to English, Dynasty 12 Middle Egyptian was to the language of the Nile. The art of Dynasty 12 deserves its own study. And if you want to understand just how African this civilization was, look at the sculpture. The statues of Senusret III are some of the most psychologically powerful portraits in the entire ancient world. Unlike the idealized, eternally young faces of Old Kingdom pharaohs, Senusret III's statues show a man who looks tired, careworn, heavy-lidded, a man who has ruled and fought and knows what it costs. Egyptologist Dorothea Arnold, in Studies of Middle Kingdom Sculpture, notes that this shift toward realistic portraiture in Dynasty 12 was deliberate. The pharaoh was being shown not as a god removed from human experience, but as a powerful man engaged with the weight of kingship. The faces are unmistakably African: strong brows, broad features, dark stone, and they stare at you across 4,000 years with an authority that has not faded. Under the later rulers of Dynasty 12, particularly Senusret III, who reigned from around 1878 BC to 1839 BC, Egypt expanded further than it had since the early Old Kingdom. Senusret III pushed deep into Nubia, reaching as far south as the Second Cataract of the Nile, near what is today the Sudanese city of Wadi Halfa. He built a string of massive fortresses along this stretch, at sites including Semna and Kuma, designed to control movement in and out of Egypt's southern territories. Archaeologist Barry Kemp, in his work Ancient Egypt, Anatomy of a Civilization, describes these Nubian fortresses as some of the most sophisticated military architecture of the Bronze Age anywhere in the world. They had granaries, administrative quarters, docking facilities, and signals systems. They were towns dressed as forts. Senusret III also reorganized the internal government of Egypt in ways that reshaped the country for generations. He reduced the power of the regional lords, the nomarchs, who had been a source of instability since the collapse of the Old Kingdom. He moved administrative power back to the center, to the royal court. Nicholas Grimal, in A History of Ancient Egypt, identifies this as one of the most significant governance reforms in Egyptian history. It was not just politics, it was the creation of a state that actually worked. And then there is the Fayum. The Fayum is a large depression west of the Nile, connected to the river by a natural channel. During Dynasty 12, the kings, particularly Amenemhat III, turned it into one of the most productive agricultural regions in Egypt's history through large-scale irrigation works. They regulated the flow of water from the Nile into the Fayum Basin, using a system of dikes and canals, dramatically increasing the amount of land under cultivation. Amenemhat III, who ruled from around 1860 BC to 1814 BC, is the pharaoh most associated with these Fayum works. He also built two pyramids, one at Dashur, known as the Black Pyramid, and one at Hawara. The Hawara pyramid is now largely destroyed, but attached to it was a structure that ancient Greek visitors, centuries later, described with absolute awe. They called it the Labyrinth. The Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the 5th century BC, wrote that this building exceeded the pyramids themselves in the wonder it inspired. He described 12 covered courts, 3,000 rooms, half of them underground. Egyptologist Flinders Petrie, who excavated the site in 1888 and documented his findings in Hawara, Biahmu, and Arsino, confirmed the scale of the foundations. The structure may have been a massive mortuary complex for the administration of the royal burial cult and the surrounding nomes of Egypt. Whatever it was built in Africa over 3,800 years ago, and it was so large that the Greeks, who saw the pyramids, were more impressed by this. Let that sit. One more thing must be said about this dynasty that is often overlooked. Dynasty 12 built schools. The institution known as the House of Life, the Perank, functioned as a combination of scriptorium, library, and educational institution attached to major temples. It was here that scribes were trained, texts were composed and copied, medical knowledge was recorded, and ritual knowledge was preserved. John Baines and Jaromir Malek in Atlas of Ancient Egypt note that the House of Life became a central feature of Egyptian cultural life from the Middle Kingdom onward. It was how knowledge was made to survive. Egypt was not just building tombs and temples, it was building systems for the preservation and transmission of knowledge. The Middle Kingdom, Egyptians understood that what you do not write down, you lose. And so they wrote, and they kept writing. And 4,000 years later, we are still reading. Dynasty 12 did not build the tallest pyramids. It did not leave the most famous monuments, but it left something that matters more. It left a literature, a system of governance, a reformed state, a philosophy of what it meant to be Egyptian, and it did all of this from Africa, with African people, along an African river. The next time someone tells you that Egypt was not an African civilization, show them the face of Senusret III. Show them the poetry of Sinuhi. Show them the fortresses built deep into Nubian soil by pharaohs who knew exactly where they came from. This was a golden age, not in spite of its Africanness, because of it. If you want to see the full story from the beginning, how Egypt and Nubia rose, clashed, and shaped each other from 3500 BC to the present, the complete playlist is right here. Egypt and Nubia, the complete history. Start from episode 1 and follow the whole journey. Subscribe, leave a comment, and share this with someone who needs to know this history, because it belongs to all of us.